Grammar Lesson 7.1, Reflexive Verbs. What is a reflexive verb and how is it used? Reflexive verbs are used to indicate when the subject does something to or for himself or herself. So basically the reason it's called a reflexive verb is because the action is reflected back onto the subject. When you see the pronoun say at the end of an infinitive verb, that tells you that it's a reflexive verb. When you conjugate reflexive verbs, you use a reflexive pronoun, and the subject determines which reflexive pronoun you'll use. Here are the reflexive pronouns that you'll use. If you want to say that I'm doing something to myself, then I would say me in front of the conjugated verb. If you are doing something to yourself, then you would use te. If he, she, or you, as in usted, is doing something to him or herself, the reflexive pronoun would be se. If we are doing an action toward ourselves, then we would use the reflexive pronoun nos. If y'all or you, as a group of people in Spain, are doing an action toward yourselves, then you would use the reflexive pronoun os. And then if they or you guys, as in ustedes, are doing an action toward themselves or yourselves, then you would use the reflexive pronoun se. Just like the object pronouns that you're used to using, reflexive pronouns will generally appear before a conjugated verb. If you are using an infinitive or a gerund, then you can tack the reflexive pronoun onto the end of the infinitive verb or the gerund, or you also have the option of still placing that reflexive pronoun before your conjugated verb. Here are some examples of how to conjugate a reflexive verb. In this example, we'll be using the verb lavarse, to wash oneself. If I want to say I wash, I would say yo me lavo. Tú te lavas. Usted se lava. Or él and ella would use the same form as usted, se lava. Nosotros nos lavamos. Vosotros os laváis. Ustedes se lavan. Ellos or ellas se lavan. Here's some more examples. Using the verb despertarse, which is to wake up. If I want to say just in the most general sense, in the present tense, I wake up, yo me despierto. Despertarse happens to be an E to IE stem changing verb. Let's look at an example where we use an infinitive, the infinitive form of it. Yo voy a despertarme. I'm going to wake up. You'll notice that even though despertar is in the infinitive form with the AR ending, the reflexive pronoun me still matches the subject. Same if we're using a gerund, like in this example, yo estoy despertándome. I am waking up. This is the present progressive tense. Something that you'll notice about gerunds when they're used with reflexive verbs, when you attach that reflexive pronoun to the end, you'll typically put an accent on the gerund. You can see in despertándome, the accent is over the ah. And the reason that we do this is just to maintain the original stress as far as pronunciation. Most of the time when Spanish speakers are talking about their parts of the body or clothing, they'll typically use definite and indefinite articles. So remember, your definite articles would be el, la, los, and las. Your indefinite articles would be un, una, unos, or unas. This would be more typical than using the possessive adjectives, which would be mi, mis, su, sus, tu, tus, nuestros, vuestros. Here are a couple of examples. Alejandro se quitó un zapato. So this sentence is saying Alejandro took off a shoe, whereas in English we might say Alejandro took off his shoe. Pedro necesita cepillarse los dientes. Pedro needs to brush the teeth, whereas in English you would typically say Pedro needs to brush his teeth. So this is just something to keep in mind as you use articles of clothing and body parts with the reflexive verbs, or with any verb really. Here are some of the reflexive verbs that we are going to be covering in this unit. Take a minute to match these up with your verb list or write in the ones that you don't know. As you'll notice from the list, several of these reflexive verbs are stem changing verbs, and they're going to follow the same pattern as any other stem changing verb. It's just that this time you'll also need to include the reflexive pronoun. As you are writing down the meanings of some of those reflexive verbs, you might have noticed that a lot of them look really familiar, and they are similar to some of the regular pattern verbs that you've already learned. And that's because some verbs can be reflexive or non-reflexive. If you think about the verb lavar, for example, you know that lavar means to wash. And if you're talking about washing the dishes, like in the example on the left, Lola lava los platos, it's not reflexive because you're doing the action toward something or someone else. However, if you're washing your own face, like in the example on the right, Lola se lava la cara, then it becomes reflexive. So this is something to keep in mind. A lot of verbs that you have been using, you're now going to be kind of using in a different context, just to show that you're doing the action toward yourself or someone is doing it toward themselves. If you have more questions, you can look in your textbook on pages 236 and 237 for a little bit more explanation. And there's also some practice exercises in there if you'd like to get started with a few of those.